And welcome back. As I mentioned just before the break, my next guest joining me, Richard Lyle, and he's actually part of the second guest that I've got on the 22 most influential people on the list in real estate this year, which is pretty cool. Richard's the president of ResCon, and if you don't know what ResCon is, Residential Construction Council of Ontario, and they nicknamed him the boss. So, Richard, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be back. Thank you for that. It's a little kind of embarrassing. I'm not sure what they meant by that, but anyways.
It's got to be true though, Richard, because you know what? If it's in print, it's got to be true. So listen, thanks for joining me today. I greatly appreciate it. And of course, one of the things I do want to chat with you about is what is happening in the world of residential construction, because it is, all sorts of things going on, lots of reports. Like I said, the headlines, trust me, I don't believe everything I read, but maybe you can give us kind of a breakdown. What is happening in the marketplace?
Well, we're kind of going from the frying pan into the fire, and immediately right now we're sort of in that period of chaos where, inflation is still not under control and rates are still rising. So that has had a chain reaction of effects that until that stabilizes, it's kind of hard to see where the daylight is right now. But we do know that, for example, the central banks are absolutely committed now to getting inflation under control. And they're going to do that. It does create a number of challenges. For example, quite a few projects are being put on hold right now because it's hard to sort of make the pro formas work if you don't know where your costs are going to be or what the supply chains are going to look like, a year or 2 years down the road. Because, of course, in our system, we sell first and build later. And then we've got a massive demographic challenge facing us, which is real. And there have been some analysis of that has been peer reviewed, and it's been accepted by all the political parties and most levels of government. I don't want to say every municipality is necessarily buying into it. There's still some people out there that are bizarrely saying, well, we don't have a supply problem. And it's completely mystifying how they get there. But, demographics don't lie. And so right now, if you were to average out what we're producing in Ontario over the last 10 years, you'd probably be in the range of, 70, 75,000 units a year. We need to double that in order to meet our demographic requirements. And, and some people have said, well, that's driven by immigration, maybe cut the immigration. Well, nice thought, but the fact is we've got an aging population and we've got, a declining birth rate. So in order to deal with the baby boomer cohort and bring in the people that we need to, do certain work. One of those areas, of course, is right in construction itself. We've got to stick with the immigration. So it's a good thing because, of course, I like to say that immigrants have built the Canada that we know and the GTA that we know, and they contribute massively to our prosperity and growth and quality of life and so on and so forth. But the problem is, we need to house people too. So how are we going to do that? So when you throw, a minor detail like COVID into the equation that we worked our way through, and now we're going to work our way through this correction. But coming out on the other side, we've got a huge challenge. So there are answers to those questions. This is really going to test our ability to finally kind of get it right. Let me put it to you that way. We had the luxury for years, I think, and of ignoring some of the critical issues. We saw many of these things coming for a long time, but it was hard to get the forces aligned. I think we're there now, but of course, As you know, there is more work to be done in the planning. Of course, the key to solving any problem is actually in the implementation. So it's a complex environment, and we're in difficult circumstances right now.
You broke out a lot there, and so sorry, I'm going to have to. I got to cut some of it down for you because, one of the biggest things that we need to talk about, obviously, is the construction trade. And over the next 10 years, you're going to see the highest number of people retiring or getting out of the business just due to aging population, as you mentioned earlier. And when we do talk about the new immigrants coming in, one of the things that has been suggested, of course, would be to, mandate that we bring in some of the trades. A lot of people are coming in with different degrees, but not so much, with trade papers such as, licensed plumbers, electricians. There's got to be an equivalency ability here in Ontario, in Canada, for us to, bring the trades in, get them, certified so that they can actually work in our building industry. Because again, the shortage is only going to, be extrapolated over the next few years.
That's right. And, it's interesting. I mean, there was a time, for example, when they had the rental housing boom, a massive boom in rental housing production in the 60s and 70s. The builders were actually sort of down at the docks and the train stations picking people up as they came in. Because and that actually extended back into the 50s. Somehow we lost our way from an immigration point of view. And neglected this. And so, for example, Royal Bank did a study which showed that there was a very large deficiency in skilled trades immigration. And part of that has to do with what they did with the scoring systems and so on. And there are changes that are required there. There are people working on that. We have a coalition working on this. The federal government has acknowledged it. But again, it's actually making those changes to allow for skilled trades to come in. And it's not just what we call the jewel trades like plumbers and electricians. Big area for us is in the mud trades. Anybody working with mortar or concrete or that kind of thing, where their certification of their skills isn't necessarily readily, they can't sort of show up with a certificate and say, okay, I am this person and I can do these things. But there are ways of dealing with that. And so, but we do have to move on it, because the kind of insidious demographic challenge that's facing us is that we're right at that point where the baby boomer cohort, which is almost about a quarter of our workforce, is really retiring in big numbers. And then at the same time, we might have a dip in construction activity. But when we come out of the other side of this thing, there's no question we're going to need to produce a huge amount of housing, and we're going to need those people. So we need to plan and get this right now in preparation for, a year or 2 years down the road.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, because for right now, as we take a look at the marketplace, we're coming into this being short of inventory. Definitely, I think, as you said, when we come out of this and when, people start looking at, home ownership again, and even the rental market. I mean, these are one of the things that, we've got an election coming up that I'm going to ask you after the break, because I want to get your take on what can be done and mandated. So, folks, if you're just tuning in right now, my guest is Richard Lyle, and he is the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. And, one of the things that we'll continue to discuss is, what are some of the things that can be done to solve some of the housing issues. But when we come back from the break, we'll do that. And don't forget, you can sign up for our seminar coming up this Thursday at 7 p.m. Go to thesimpleinvestor.com, and we'll be right back after this. And welcome back. If you're just tuning in right now, my guest is Richard Lyle, and he is the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. And just before the break, we were, Richard, you and I were discussing, the idea of the trades and how we have a lack of them. And it was very, very apparent over the last couple of years that inventory is getting tighter and tighter. We're coming into an election time. October is a big thing. We've got the, mayor's race all over the different municipalities, including Toronto. It's interesting, though. One of the biggest things, we saw this with the federal election, provincial election. Now, of course, when the mayors are, trying to get some votes, what they have planned for housing. And I just want to know your take on what some of the politicians are saying and, what are actually some of the solutions for some of the housing issues we have.
Well, as I mentioned before, we've seen this coming for a while, and what we're seeing looks actually quite good. Certainly at the provincial level, the Ford government has now, they've got 3 pieces of legislation that they've passed on related to housing. I think the COVID effect really accelerated, though, the impact of the housing supply situation or shortage. So there is more to be done there. The last piece was the strong mayor legislation for the city of Toronto, and I think that was, in my view, needed, and I think it will have a beneficial effect. And then the feds have some things to do yet too, which I can talk about if you like. So at the federal level, for example, one of the big things is looking back when we had, and we really do need a lot of purpose-built rental housing built. It's very important because, especially in a gig tech-based economy, you have much more labor mobility. And that means you need kind of sort of more readily available housing for people as they move. And, back it started actually in the very late 50s and then 60s and 70s, we had a purpose-built rental housing boom in the city, and the feds, through various programs, really drove the industry and encouraged the industry to build that housing. The feds need to revisit things like that because, the federal government taxes has, billions have come out of the industry into federal coffers from the production of new housing. And we need to see more of that coming back, and it can come back in programs like that. At the municipal level, the Strong Mayors Act, I think, has enabled, for example, the current mayor to announce his 5-point plan for housing, which sounds very good. Principally the creation of a new development and growth committee, which will hopefully bring together and break down some of those silos between departments in the city and what the mayor called the spin cycle of within the approvals process. And we think that's quite beneficial. Also dealing with things like exclusionary zoning, and finally dealing with mid-rise apartment and condo buildings along avenues and corridors, long overdue. In fact, I remember I was on a panel with Paul Bedford almost 20 years ago when we were talking about this and what the benefits might be, but we've just been slow to adjust.
Yeah. One of the things, and I don't know if everybody does remember, though, back in the late 80s when rent control went into place, basically we saw all the apartment built, designated buildings basically halted right there on the spot. And then moving forward, all the high rises were being built as condos. And, coming into the 90s, that was really the dawn of condominiums when we talk about the high rise. And, we've almost have to revert backwards now. I mean, I know the federal government's been trying to give some incentives, same with the provincial governments, but it's tough because of the actual time to build. And, you'd mentioned earlier in the show that we've got some people that are looking at the dollars and cents of things, pulling back, saying, it's not affordable for us to build right now. And, I've seen, a few numbers kicking around. It seems like there's going to be quite a few, developments that are going to be shelved, which is going to be very concerning because, again, the necessity to keep building, again, purpose-built rentals as well as condominiums, I think is going to keep going.
Exactly. And to sustain our workforce too. Back in the early 90s when we had the last big correction, you might recall there was also a bit of a nonprofit housing boom then, and which was, it was what it was. But one thing it did enable us to do is keep our crews and contractors working to a large extent. Otherwise, we would have lost a lot of people, and we can't afford to lose people right now because I think, Todd, the good news in all this is that when we come out of this, we're going to be on fire. And the demand for housing is going to be possibly even greater than it is now. So we need to pivot and create those opportunities, especially at the federal level, say, for example, on the purpose-built rentals, because it's ironic right now in the U.S., there's a boom on purpose-built rental housing underway. And we're not experiencing that here. And they're 96% of their multifamily, we call it, it's condos, apartment buildings, multifamily housing in the U.S. is in purpose-built rental. That should be happening here, and it's not. And you can break that down. There's, I think, a number of reasons for that, but it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm glad you brought that up because, again, this comes back to the federal and provincial level of throwing in incentives. You mentioned that obviously with interest rates, would it not behoove the government to turn around and say, okay, you know what, why don't we lend money to some of the developers to be able to build this?
The problem when they get into lending money and programs like that is, for example, the amount of time it takes, because then you need a bureaucracy that's going to evaluate projects and so on and so forth, and it just takes too long. The better route is through the tax system via tax credits, and there were old programs. One was called the MERB program. There was a limited dividend program. And so you can work those incentives in, if you want to call them incentives, into that process. And it can trigger a much more rapid response from the industry.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, everybody likes a tax break. So, listen, Richard, I do want to thank you for joining me again today. Always a pleasure having you on the show. I do look forward to probably having a chat with you, in the new year, and we'll see where we're sitting. So thanks once again for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Folks, that was Richard Lyle, and he is the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario.